I want you to know it's a pleasure to be here this evening and to have the opportunity to visit with you about a subject which perhaps in school, 8th grade through high school, you did not like. History, geography, social studies, those classes were the kind that boys especially seemed to want to stay away from. And in high school, I had one world history teacher by the name of Mr. Reed. By now, he's passed on, but Mr. Reed came alive for every class that he taught on world history. We would walk into the classroom, and he would be standing on top of the desk, dressed in military outfit of General Patton. And he had his little stick in his hand, okay? He had a stuffed dog on the desk, just like, General Patton had. And he would start walking back and forth on this desk in military cadence as he gave the lecture that day. His blackboards all along the side and behind him were covered in notes and maps that he had drawn just getting ready for us. Nobody would come in that class late because he was a militarian. He knew what to do with anybody that would show up to a class a few minutes late. The next thing that he did was to make history exciting, to make it a living example of what our country had just come through. And since I was in high school shortly after World War II, it was fresh on his mind what it was all about. He also said that in the process that he had been shot here and here and here, and he had 3 Purple Hearts to show that he had gone into the service. And each time he recovered from a mortal wound, they put him back on the front lines again. They only did that 3 times. But Mr. Reed gave me an interest in history. As I also became interested in genealogy about that same time, it was because I went to church one evening, and I found that by going and listening to that teacher teach about her family and the history that her family had lived through, I saw the parallel between Mr. Reed's history class and what she was doing. I went home that night after Mutual and I said to my mother, "Mom, do we have any interesting stories about our ancestors?" You'd think I'd lit a fuse. She went to the closet, up on the top shelf, took down this great big thick heavy genealogy book that long, you remember? And she brought it down, set it on the kitchen table, and as she showed me pictures, she told stories. And I was hooked. So from being a teenager until presently today, I've always liked history as it pertains to my family. So our topic this evening is knowing your history, your family's history in the country they came from and they lived through, helps you to find your ancestors. We're going to look at some of the areas in which you need to become familiar. These are tools in the toolbox. And as you become familiar with how to use those tools, you become more effective at finding your family. Census records is one of those areas. The second one is understanding the 10 worst diseases, epidemics, pandemics that affected our country, and how your ancestors may have gone through that time period or lost members of their family due to it. The third one is America's wars. Now I have to tell you, we've been in war for a long time in this country. If we arrived in this country on the first boats in the first 1600s, and we're now 400 years later, we've been at war with one group or another for all but 47 years. So we've always had somebody that we needed to have protection from. So America's wars are mostly necessary to understand, to see what your ancestors went through. The next one is going to be the major weather storms and how they may have affected your family. So as I tiptoe through these different events, what I want you to do is to think about your family that lived through some of these things. Now we have challenges in our day as our ancestors had challenges in their day. Understanding those will help you to find them. And the last one is to understand the migration west. For the most part, your ancestors did not start in the west coast and move east. They started in the east and they moved west. So as you understand that migration pattern and what was going on, I think it's going to help you to understand where to look. Our ancestors wanted a better way to live. They were tired of the hard times. They began the migration to the New World, America. The census records will help you track your ancestors. They're usually the first stop in genealogical research, and they're often researched inadequately. It's like a tool in the toolbox, and you pick it up and you gouge the wood with that tool instead of learning how to caress the tool and get the proper end result that you want. We've got to learn how to use those better. The census enumerator many times was a school teacher. In society, they were more educated. They were usually off duty during the summer times, and the rest of the members of their class that they taught were now working in the fields on the farm. Okay? So many times the school teachers became the enumerators. And if the enumeration was on June 1st, they were out there in that county working the streets, going up and down each farm usually, going from farm to farm. And sometimes when they got to those farms, they didn't find the person home at the doorstep to listen to them. Other times they did. The Saturday Evening Post was illustrating the enumerator. Mother with how many children? My goodness. Okay. And he's going to ask her all of those questions that are on that census report. They faced many challenges, and the one that we recognize the most is spelling. When it came to the spelling of your ancestor's last name, they didn't all do it the same. They spoke phonetically. The English rules came about around the 1900 time period. So they spelled it as they heard it. And there was even a time period where it was really educationally proper to be able to spell your name 3 different ways to show your intelligence. So on many documents, you find the spelling is different. You find the census records are close to the birth date, but not always exact. One of the reasons is that when you look at a census record, if the enumerator was there on June 1st, was there on, let's say, August 10th, the question he asked is, where were you on June 1st? Not when I show up there in August. I'm asking the question, where were you and your family members on June 1st? When they said, well, let's see, yeah, we're still at the same place. Then he'd say, how old is the baby? And they'd say, 5 months. No, on June 1st, how old was the baby? 3 months. Okay. Now, if they said that the child was 3/12, 3 months prior to June 1st means the baby was born in March, right? Got to remember that in order to understand the census records, you've got to understand the tool. Read it carefully. Look to see what the enumeration date is for that census. Look to see when he was actually there. Okay? And it makes a difference when they say 3/12. Yes. On the very top line on the right-hand side has his name and has the date. But there's some instructions for every time period, every census time period. They ask different questions. Okay? And the question always, the answer is, they always told in those instructions what the date was that they wanted to count everybody as of that date. Let's say that somebody died in May. So if the question is, who did you have in your household on June 1st? They would have to eliminate the person that just died the month before. So if you read the instructions of what the census is all about, I think you'll understand better where your family is. Okay. This one shows that the enumerator is coming to the household. He may not find mother at home, but he finds all the kids. Did it say in the instructions to ask only the mom or dad in the family? No. They could have asked anybody about the neighbor. How do you think they did on birth dates? How do you think they did even on spelling of the last name, right? And if you had a couple of generations of family members living in the same household, oh my goodness, did they get everybody? So a census record is not perfect, but it's a very good start. Every 10 years, you get to follow your family and see where they were. Sometimes, when the enumerator came to the household, he found that they didn't speak the same language as he did. Oh my goodness. Have you ever heard a deep Swedish accent? Sometimes you might spell what you heard, but when you and I are looking for it today, it's going to take a good computer algorithm to figure out what in the world it could have been, right? Okay. We want to learn to follow the clues that we learn. It's a step-by-step process. Don't assume that all information is correct in a census record. It's a guide. It's kind of like horseshoes. All it has to do is come close. But my feeling is get two records. There are 3 records that tell their approximate information, and then you make the analysis. You decide which one is right. Always look at the original image. When you get a chance to look at an index copy of what someone else has interpreted it meant, you may not always agree with what you see. Click the original image, and now you'll see the family as it was originally written down in 1850 or 1880. That's important also. When you're searching for information in census records, remember, families migrated together. If they were farmers, which most people were, farmers are like birds of a feather stick together, okay? They shared the same tools. They shared the same livestock in order to plow the field and to harvest, to pull the wagons. It was hard for a man to do all the work on the farm that needed to be done. But if his brother lived next door and he had 5 sons, that's a winning combination. Later, if one of those brothers wants to move to another area, what do? They move together. Why? They learn to work together. Okay? So, families migrated together, ethnic groups, by religion, by occupation. They had a tendency to do it in the same place with each other that they knew. That doesn't mean the next farm, when you're looking at a census page, it means look at the whole area, spread it out. If you think that you have if you're looking for just one family and his name is John Jones, you look up the page and down below John Jones to see if there's any more families living next door or close by. Turn the page, look on the next page, see if he just happened to live backdoor neighbors to each other, but they're on the other street and there's 10 or 12 farms between them. In other words, you miss using a census record if you don't look at the whole county. Find the whole family, not just the one name you're looking for. You'll have more success. In 1890, we had a special problem, and that was that the American census burned. We have every census except that one. In some of them, we only have parts of a census. And you need to know, when you get ready to go into that census, if that one part is where your family was. So don't assume that because you didn't find it, that they aren't there. They may have been, and that record's not available. In the 1890 census, most of the census records burned. Now we had a problem in Congress. If we take the records that did survive and look to see what those numbers of people in that state have, maybe they should qualify for one more senator or two more House of Representative members or whatever. So they thought, gosh, that's not a good idea if we look and see what Texas had, and we lost New York in fire. So what did they do? They burned the rest of the records. So three things happened. If the fire didn't get it, the fire hose did, and if that didn't get it, the politicians did. So 1890 census, for all practical reasons, is not available to us. Unfortunately, as you trace your families, that's the very record that you want. It's the one that would have given you the clues that you need to have to know for sure. So some of the things that you might find is that states sent their records to the federal government, and some states, not all, have tried to reconstruct who was living in their state in 1890. Go to your wiki at FamilySearch, put in the name of your county, and look for state census records and see if they have got state census records of 1885, 1895, and maybe they've reconstructed what they have for the 1890. Good clue. Okay, the second thing that you want to know is that America has not always been a healthy place to live. Okay? Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Look at some of these things. The 10 worst diseases, epidemic outbreaks that took place in America. The first one is that yucky looking thing. You know what that is? We don't see it in our society much, but that's smallpox, okay? When smallpox broke out in the East Coast in 1633 and 1634, that early time period, 70% of the Indian tribes in the East Coast died from smallpox. 70%. When we look later at some of the maps of where the Indians are located by tribes in the United States, the northeast section is missing. We didn't use bullets. We used smallpox. And it eliminated 70% of those that were living at that point in time. It was a terrible disease. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the last case of smallpox in the United States was in 1949. So that one is almost on its way out. The next one is called yellow fever. There was an outbreak of yellow fever in 1793 in Philadelphia. Conditions were perfect for mosquitoes there, which help spread the disease that causes yellowing of the skin, fever, and vomiting of blood clots. Now, the signers of the Declaration of Independence stopped their deliberations and got out of the city while this epidemic was going on. And you read that in our history. An estimated 2,000 people died before wintertime came from yellow fever in Philadelphia. Next one is going to be cholera. Now, from 1830 to 1851, they refer to that as the second cholera pandemic. To this day, cholera, an infection of the small intestine, still affects between 3 and 5 million people and causes nearly 130,000 deaths worldwide per year. The last documented outbreak in the United States was in 1911 from cholera. Okay? Before then, there were a number of outbreaks, but none worse than the one that we're mentioning right here. The pandemic began in India and then swiftly spread across the globe via all the trade routes. Okay? Settlers traveling along the Mormon and Oregon trails brought cholera to the United States from the east to the west, killing an estimated 150,000 people. Now, when you get to these bigger numbers, not 3,000, 150,000, you may find family members in your families died of these diseases that we're looking at right now. The next one is going to be this one, and this one to me is one of the most misunderstood, really strong truths of what happened. 1918. What's going on in Europe? World War I. Did they call it World War I? There hadn't been any others, so it was the World War. And afterwards, for 20 years, they called it the Great War. The war that would end all wars. Did it? No. Okay. What's commonly referred to as the Spanish flu is a misnomer. Spain was no more affected than any other European country, nor was it the source of the disease. Where did it get its start? On a farm in the Midwest, probably Kansas. Do you know what it is? It's a rare thing that happens, but sometimes it does. When you get farm animals like a hog that is able to get its cell structure inside a human, it creates a weird disease that spreads to everybody and has instantly violent effects on those people. A healthy person in their 20s on Monday reports for duty and says to the Army officer, "I'm here, I'm ready to go to war." On Wednesday, he's dead. 3 days is all it took. It didn't kill the young people, and it didn't kill the old people. It killed the healthiest people that we had. And it was scary. The flu outbreak orphaned children. As you go through your census records, you're going to find people missing in your families. Maybe adults closed down schools and businesses and left the nation without important services because of ill workers. 1918, an estimated 675,000 Americans died in a matter of months. And 20 million people died across the globe before the pandemic subsided. Is that a large number? Have we had anything today that would kill 675,000 people? Do you know how many families were affected by this? Our population was not that big at that point in time. Every family lost somebody to the Spanish influenza called the flu. So as you look through your census records, you want to look to see if maybe somebody in those families were yours. In the 1940s and the 1950s, we had another one that came in. Most of us were part of that. We remember this one. This one scared moms and dads. This was called polio. It was an epidemic. Polio is a viral disease that affects the nervous system. The first major polio epidemic in the United States occurred in 1916, but in 1952, it hit with a vengeance. Okay? Here's what happened. Small towns were quarantined to protect the public from affected individuals. It reached a peak in 1952 when over 58,000 cases of polio were reported, including 3,145 deaths. Thanks to effective vaccine, the United States has been polio-free since 1979. How many carried a mark on their shoulder for many, many years to show that you had been vaccinated from polio? Moms and dads were afraid their kids might be affected by that. Did anybody get vaccinated more than once? There are a few that did. Better twice than not at all. Okay. An outbreak of this next one in 1957 was called the Asian flu pandemic. I got it. I'd never been hit by anything that bad before. I was living in Utah at the time. I was a teenager. and it knocked me right off my feet. It was bad. An outbreak of this virus originated in China in early 1956. It reached the United States by June of the following year. Luckily, unlike the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, the Asian flu outbreak was swiftly identified. If they hadn't got on top of this one fast, this could have been a killer. A vaccine was created, and by the winter of 1957, the worst was over. It hit strong and hard, and boom, the vaccine knocked it out. Nevertheless, the Asian flu caused the death of nearly 70,000 Americans before it was completely eradicated. This next one I didn't hear much about, but there's always a question about when you're canning your own veggies, especially things that have acid in them, that you do it right, under the right conditions. In 1977, 59 cases of botulism were linked to hot sauce from a Mexican restaurant that used improperly canned jalapeno peppers. While the number of cases was small in that instance, it served as a warning sign. Botulism is a preventable disease caused by the most part by improperly handled foods. For 30 years, there was no canned food induced cases of botulism. Then in 2007, 8 people contracted the disease after consuming Castleberry's food company brand canned foods. So it's not one that really took out a lot of people, but it's scary enough because nowadays we prepare all of our meals from fresh veggies and all that kind of stuff, and we never use anything that's canned or packaged, right? Okay. Here comes another one. I could use a little help on pronouncing that first word. Cryptosporidium outbreak. Jiminy Christmas. We're in Milwaukee. 2 water treatment plants became contaminated with whatever that is, a parasitic disease that causes dehydration, fever, stomach cramps, and diarrhea. 403,000 people there became ill. More than 100 people died, making it the largest waterborne outbreak in U.S. history. The cause of the contamination was never found. But it's another one of those things that what happens if the water supply isn't clean and good and pure and all the rest? Wow. The next one comes from the Mayo Clinic. It says in the year 2010, just a few years ago, whooping cough outbreak in California got everybody nervous. Why? Pertussis, known as whooping cough, is highly contagious, characterized by violent coughing. Whooping cough is one of the most commonly occurring diseases in the United States. In 1941, I was in first grade. My brother was not. He was younger. We both got whooping cough. So we whooped and we coughed around the house for 6 weeks. By the time we were finally well enough to go back to school, the school teacher said to my mother, "Gary has missed too much of the basic, what we teach in first grade. Be best if he repeats first grade." So I got to repeat first grade due to whooping cough. And it's a bad thing when you're a kid. Okay, this one is what we're talking about right now. We've been in this one for 30 years. It's called the AIDS epidemic. 1980s is when it was first found. It was documented in 1981. The epidemic we now know as HIV began to appear as a rare lung infection characterized by a weakened immune system. Okay? The virus is passed through blood transfusions or use of needles, sexual contact, or from pregnant women to her child. In 2011, it marked the 30th year of AIDS in the United States. So what you're looking at in the things that we've talked about so far is when your relatives disappear from those census records. Was it because of disease, a pandemic, an illness? Was it from military service, you always have to question, why can't I find them? I found them there, 10 years later, dad's missing, or mother's missing, okay? So you want to find the reason for it. One of the ways that I like to encourage you to do is to go to FamilySearch.org to the wiki. This is the URL address for it on the screen. What this shows you is a chance to go in and to type on that URL line the county and the state that you want to know more about. The website is then going to take you to all of the websites that it has found that helps you to know where your family might have been in this particular county. In this case, I've gone into Kansas. I'm looking at the blue lettering, which is going to be links that take you to Kansas Vital Record Abstracts. A little bit below that, Kansas births and christenings, marriages, deaths, military records, Indian wars, okay, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, Civil War. You're going to be able to help find your ancestors if you know the history of the area they lived in. Get into that area and find out the questions that you have in your mind. When your family lived there, what was their occupation? What did they do to make a living? Okay? What church did they attend? You can tell that on a census record. Just go down the list until you find who the preacher was. And then look off to the side to see whether it was Methodist or Protestant or whatever it may have been. Right? And then, who had the big bucks in the area? You can tell that by seeing who had the land values the highest. And how does that compare to your family? Were you the servants to them? Or did you live next door? Okay? You can tell a lot about the wealth of a family by looking down the list of the neighbors. Why did the people move to that county? What was the draw? Was there, it's not like you think today, we build a Motorola plant and then everybody comes to go to work there, or an Intel plant, okay? Why did they come to your county? What was it that brought them there? Was it free land? You know? Was it something that was an incentive to come? What was the ethnic neighborhood like where your family lived? What language did they speak? People of different ethnic backgrounds have a tendency to live in the same neighborhood of people that they trust and they feel good about. The German families lived here. The Polish families lived right next door. The French families had to live clear over on the other side. I mean, that's just the way they did it. Okay? How many related families live nearby? Don't stop with just the name you're going for. Find everybody in that county that had the same surname. At least that finds them in. Do you know many times the oldest daughter marries somebody and lives just a farm or two away from mom and dad? So when you're looking at mom and dad's record, more than likely their married daughter, who was at home 10 years census before, is now married and just lives a couple doors down. Look in the earlier census and find the names of those older daughters, and then look 10 years later and see the first names of the neighbors that have a different last name now. You can't believe how many times you're missing family if you don't really learn to use that census record. It's a roadmap for you. Read the county history so you can find out what's really going on. Okay, this next one is going to talk about America's wars. I'm sorry that this takes a minute or two to go through, but by golly, we've been at this so long, and you need to know why your family's life pattern got disturbed. And it did. Our ancestors have been involved in obtaining land of their own. When they lived in Europe, the wealthy owned the land. When they came to America, they had a chance to own land. Terra. Okay? Those feelings of having your own land. You can support your family if you have your own land. You can take care of them. In time periods where our country has gone through depressions, and 1890 was the worst depression that ever happened in the United States, not the 1930s. 1890, But do you know why we don't hear much about it? Most of the people lived on farms. They didn't have cash to go buy something new, but they had food to get them through. So in the 1890s, we had the worst cash depression of our entire history. We don't hear a lot about it, but you're going to find that families made it because they had the seeds, they had the dirt, they had the water, and they got through. I worry about my kids. Seeds? Do they know how to garden? Do they know how to grow enough to get by? Do they have enough in storage right now to get by until their first crop comes in? At that point in time, we won't be thinking about growing grass and making it look good to keep up with the neighbors. We'll be thinking that that's a cornfield. Okay? Do we already have the water supply to the ground? We got the dirt. We may have to put some corn in there and learn how to get by as our ancestors did 100 years ago. Okay? Our ancestors also established in each of the counties a school so their kids could get an education. Between doing farm work, you still had to have time to raise the crops, put in the crops, weed them, water them, and harvest them. Okay? The rest of the time you could go to school. But supporting your life was first. They also built a church in every county. That way they were able to balance their lives. Now, when threatened that perhaps the enemy coming in was going to take all of that away from them, it wasn't too hard for somebody in the county that you trusted to step forward and say, boys, let's go get those guys out of here. Okay? So that's how they did it in the olden days. They recruited from the county. The people that went to war from your county were people you knew. It may be your father and your brother and your uncle in the same outfit. So when you're looking at military records, look to see if maybe there's a chance that those people in those regiments from that county are interrelated. They probably are. You want to understand where your ancestors lived and married and died. You have to understand how these wars interrupted their lives. Millions of American citizens have served in the armed forces from the beginning of our nation. Chances are good that one or more of your relatives served at one time or another. By the raise of hands, do you have any ancestors that have served in military in the United States Armed Forces? My goodness, we're all there. Some of us have even done it ourselves. Okay. An ancestor may have enlisted in the military during peacetime. There are relatively few American families whose genealogies would not benefit from a search of military records. Download 2 quick starts from our Mesa FamilySearch Library website and get the help you need to find their records. This is what a quick start looks like. It's fantastic. It tells you where to start. It goes steps 1, 2, 3. What is his name? When did he serve? What unit did he serve in? What other information do I have? And then the next part that I've cut off down here tells you what websites to go to find these records. If you really want to know where your family was in this time period, download the pre-20th century wars or the 20th century wars. That breaks the country into 2 parts. There are different process of where you go to get the records from each one of those groups. Download that from the website Mesa FSL, standing for Family Search Library.org. And then go to research_help and download those 2 quick starts, and you have a start on finding the records that you want to have. Recruiting took place through 1900. The newspapers or bulletins tacked to a tree would say things such as this. Now, this was great fun going out to the Google to images and telling them that you want old, enlistment flyers that were used to help get our young people to join up. General Washington wants you to serve in the Continental Line of the United States Army. Okay? Wanted 25 men to do this. They'll be called Indiana snake killers. Okay? The next one is going to be America's first international conflict, the French and Indian War. Between 1689 and 1763, England and France were engaged in 4 separate wars. They were fought in Europe, but that kept the money going to their armies in those countries, so that we had a little effect here in our country, but not nearly the effect we could have had they had all their money and all their armies to come on us. Okay? So this time period is called the French and Indian War. British troops eventually exceeded 20,000 in America. Do you know how many people from Britain who called themselves English died or stayed in America because of their exposure here? A lot of them. You may find in your research, you always thought you were American, but you didn't realize it was one of those British deserters that was your immigrant ancestor. Kind of fun. American colonial troops had limited involvement. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, 3 states, furnished 7/10 of the colonial troops in the French and Indian Wars. Those 3 states produced 70% of the military. That's most of it. Okay? The 7 Years' War was between the British colonies and French Canadians. This is the upper northeast section of the United States. That red line is going down the St. Lawrence River to Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, into the Great Lakes region. This red line is the British troop movements. Okay? The French victories are where the blue asterisks are. They're down here towards the bottom of the map. And the British victories are where the red asterisks are. So those guys were doing battle just north of our area, but they did affect that northeast corner. Okay, Revolutionary War. This one took place 1775 to 1783. What's that time period? 8 years. When George went out to fight and be our leader, he didn't get it done immediately. All of these soldiers were farmers. They had to have time to plant the crops, then go fight, then get back so that they can harvest. Okay? If they didn't, their families wouldn't make it through the next winter. So as you look at the American Revolution, you're looking to see what was going on at the time. I think one of the more interesting things that happened during that time period was that we had the founding of the United States Army in June of 1775. The Navy was created in October 1775, and the Marine Corps November 1775. Within a few months, all 3 big branches of the military were created. The Revolutionary War has another interesting characteristic to it. It only involved 1% of the total population. This is the one where we're declaring our freedom from England. And only 1% of the population is involved in the war. The other 99 are trying to live. I didn't know it was that low, but it is. It says that we lost an estimated 25,000 Americans during that war. It was the most costly war that America fought except for the Civil War. The next one is going to show where it took place. Now, where those stars are is the northeast colonial states, once again, right up there in that northeast section. That's where the fighting took place there, and it also took place in the southeastern colonial states, right in that circled area. There's a couple of areas where the wars took place. Okay? This is where you'd go to find information on how to research the Revolutionary War records. Once again, go to Family Search Catalog, use the place, search by state, and then military records in that state. That will help you find the records there. Go to Ancestry.com or Fold3.com for an extensive collection of digital records online. Do that from home. That's easy. You can go to any of the other places that are also available. The DAR is the Daughters of the American Revolution. The Patriot Index is online, and that's another one that would help you find Revolutionary War. The next big war was called the War of 1812. This is one of the reasons we got involved in that war. What's happening there? The British are coming on board our ships, taking our men and saying, you used to be in the Navy for Britain. We're taking you back, and we're going to hang you. Friendly people, right? All right, that was not good. So that has a special name to it, and it's called impressment of men off U.S. ships. Also, the majority of British resources were tied up at this time in the War of 1812. Otherwise, we would have had a 1776 all over again. Do you know who Britain was fighting at that time in Europe? He always stood with his hand in his jacket like this. Napoleon. All the resources were to fight Napoleon. So we got through 1812 pretty good. Otherwise, we would have had another real battle on our hands. The U.S. mobilized 450,000 militiamen. Less than half ever saw service on the fighting. But we got more people up in arms at that time than we'd ever done before. These are big numbers, 450,000 soldiers. Okay. After the British came in and they burned what we call today the White House, Washington, D.C., the next thing that happened is they then moved on to Baltimore, and they were going to take over Baltimore. But there was a fort over there called McHenry. And the British and all the Navy boats were out there in the bay, and they were shelling that thing all night. And there was one man that was standing on board the ship watching the shelling. And what does he write down for a poem? Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light, right? Was our flag still there? And it was. It may have had a bullet hole or two through it, but it was still there. The Star-Spangled Banner became his poem. Okay, War of 1812 had an interesting victory that took place in Louisiana. This guy came from Tennessee, and every time he said, boys, let's go get those Brits out of there. They followed him. That state today has a motto. What does it say on their license plates? Volunteers. Those people there come to the aid whenever Andrew Jackson would call them. He said, the Brits are in Louisiana. They're going to come right up that Mississippi River. They're going to be in our backyard. Let's go get them out of there. The problem was, communication was slow at that time. We had already signed the peace treaty in Paris, and they didn't know about it. So they went down and threw the Brits out after the peace treaty, and we got away with it. All right, interesting sideline. This victory caused people to realize that when Andrew Jackson goes to war, he wins. He never loses. They eventually rewarded him with the presidency of the United States. Okay? It was a lopsided American victory after the peace treaty was signed. Okay. After these number of wars, America realized that having a militia army where people just come up from the counties to fight when we need them, we better get a little bit better organized and have a professional military and start getting serious about this. Okay? That's when they began to train at different military institutions, one of which is West Point. Okay? Regulars and militia had uneven performance throughout the War of 1812. Too many guys went back home to plant the crops. So they decided they better get more serious and begin to train on purpose at West Point and at Annapolis, and to become ready for the next war that would come along. And sure enough, in America, it does. The Mexican War only lasted a couple of years. Here's where it basically took place. We would think that it would be in the Southwest. Texas is right in the middle of it. You see those blue and yellow striped areas? That's a disputed area where Mexico says that's ours and Texas says, no, we want it. So we went to war over that. You notice the blue area going out to California. What's the time period? 1846 to 1848. What happened in California in 1849? If they'd known that, they should have fought harder to keep it. If the United States had known that, they should have got that war over quicker than 2 years before anybody discovered there was millions and billions in gold in California. Good heavens. That was the prize. Okay. We had 15,540 men after the declaration of war with Mexico. The Mormon Battalion sent 500. Okay. Also, 50,000 of militia volunteers were authorized for 1 year or the duration of the war. Many junior officers in the Mexican War would become major figures in Civil War, including Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and Jefferson Davis. Interesting. When you want to find military records, there's basically 4 places that you go. FamilySearch.org, Google.com, Ancestry.com, and Fold3.com. When you get to those websites, do a place search and look for the state military records. In Google, look for the state archives and military records that they have. At Ancestry.com and Fold3.com, which used to be footnotes, may also have collections with access to the Mexican War records. Now this is the big one, the American Civil War. There won't be anybody that you do research on your ancestry, if they were alive in America at this time, that did not lose members of their family to death, and most of them had family members come back from the war with physical limitations that lasted the rest of their lives. Arms and legs, if you get a bullet in your arm, you cut it off here. If the bullet's higher, you cut it off here. They didn't just fix the spot, they cut off limbs. So this was a really, really bad war. States' rights was the main point of contention that led up to the Civil War between the North and the South. The first 2 years, most troops were provided by states through their county militias. Okay? The Civil War saw the first use of the draft on the American continent to maintain armies. Now, nobody likes the draft, but this is when it got its start. And by the end of the Civil War, that became the way that the government would get troops for the next war they needed to be part of, drafting. The implementation of the draft led to riots in both the North and the South. New York felt like they had been picked on because of all the wars that took place in their neighborhood. And it eventually required federal troops straight from the battlefield of Gettysburg to come to New York and put out the fire. Okay? Because those people didn't like the draft. By the end of the war, most troops were recruited through the draft. In the northern states, you basically see it's the blue ones. The southern states are the rebels because they rebelled against, right? The light blue states, right in the middle, have got some real problems. Kids in the same family had differing views and served on both sides of the war. One brother was for the North, the other brother was for the South. These states took as neutral a position as they could. Their neighbors had slaves. They didn't. Because of this war, the friction between those families was tremendously increased. It's a very hard place for people to live before, during, and after the Civil War in those light blue states because they disagreed on their political views. In June 1860, all right, the Civil War is 1861 to 1865, 4 years. In 1860, in June, just before that, the regular army consisted of 1,000 officers and 14,000 enlisted men. Of the officers, 824 were West Point graduates. 286 officers left the U.S. Army to join the Confederacy, and of these, 184 were West Point graduates. Those officers leaving to join the Confederacy included many of the most senior and experienced officers in the United States Army. They went to the South. And the top general was Robert E. Lee, fifth great-grandfather. Total deaths of all America's wars from Revolution to today does not equal the number killed on both sides of the war from 1861 to 1865. 625,000 Americans died in that 4-year time period. If you count all of the military deaths from the beginning wars with the Indians when we first got off the boat until the present time, which includes World War I and II, we lost more Americans in the Civil War than we have in all of the other wars added together. Did you lose members of your families, of your ancestors, in the Civil War? Almost guaranteed. So if you want to find out where these holes are, do a little experiment. In 1860, what was the names of the family members? 10 years later, 1870, who is still listed as a family member and who's missing? You're going to get some clues as to who in your family may have been part of this tremendous bloodbath. Okay? The census records tell you a clue. The 1890 Veterans Schedule didn't get burned. The Veterans Schedule tells you who the veterans were in 1890 of the last wars that we had had, which included Civil War. The 1910 U.S. Census has a column on the far right that says, were you a veteran of the Civil War? So a 1910 census, find your family. Look at that last column. If there's a check mark, they're a veteran of that war. That's not bad. This is learning to use your tools better, right? 1930 U.S. Census, which war they fought in. Now you have somebody that would say WW. Because in 1930, there was no WW2. So they served in the World War, right? Or if they served in the Civil War, that would be indicated. But those are some censuses right off the bat that might help you to find your American ancestry that were affected by military. Now these are the time periods. I won't go through the detail of it, but the colonial and Indian wars from the time they got off the boat, 1607 to 1890s, is 283 years of having to worry about whether you can send the kids down to the creek and fetch a pail of water or not. Whether you can walk or ride through the forest to your grandparents' house. There was always the feeling that there was going to be an Indian behind every tree, behind every bush. And why not? What had the European immigrants to this country done? They took over somebody else's land. And they fought each other for 283 years. It's a long time. You get down to the Revolutionary War, lasted 8 years. War of 1812, 3. Mexican War, 2. Civil War, 4 years, and we lost more people than any other war, and all of them put together aren't as many as we lost in the Civil War. Spanish-American War was a 1-year war or less. Philippine insurrection was 3 years. World War I, less than a year. We were in and out of World War I in 6 months. You know what we were in World War I? We were the difference. Here's the good guys, here's the bad guys, and they're deadlocked. They're in trenches, and they can't seem to overpower each other, so they're just stuck there. They've been there for years. The Americans came in and put the push. They put them over the top. And that's what happened in World War I. World War II lasted 4 years, 41 to 45. Quickly looking at the Indian tribes, if you look up in the northeast section of the United States, you don't see Indian names. Because 70% of the Indians died from smallpox, a European disease. 4 or 5 tribes come out of the southern states. The majority come from north to south through the plains area. A few out here in the west, and that's it. That's basically where the tribes were located at that point in time. The military records for finding Indian records can be found on the same websites that we've mentioned, and it helps you to trace the Indians back to the Dawes records, which takes place after they are on reservations. From that point to the present, we've got records. Prior to that, the Indian people didn't keep records in that way. Therefore, we can't trace ancestry beyond that. The Spanish-American War is interesting for a couple of features. That one right there. Whoops, I clicked that one too many times. Spanish-American War was only a year. See, it was fought between the United States and Spain. The war got its start. The U.S. Army had a strength of 26,000. Mobilization allowed for a regular army of 65,000 and a volunteer army of 200,000. So it grew very rapidly for a short war. The actual fighting began in June when the Marines captured Guantanamo Bay. We still have it. Interesting. And 17,000 U.S. troops were landed on Cuba. The two most well-known actions of the war was charging up San Juan Hill, which is the one I rushed past a little bit too quick. The troops involved, including the Rough Riders, a volunteer unit, and it was led by a lieutenant colonel by the name of, you got it, my dad had one of those rifles as one of his keepsakes that he thought was special. So, you know, that was Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. May 1st, destruction of Spanish fleet in Manila Bay by Admiral Dewey, another name we've heard before. Now, the Spanish-American War also took place in this part just south of Florida and also in the Philippine Islands. Okay? Look at that scattering of islands. Good heavens. Guess what happened at the end of the Spanish-American War? We lost 3,000 people, soldiers, in that war. The U.S. purchased the Philippine Islands from Spain for $20 million. They ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States as territories, and they still are. And the peace treaty was signed in Paris, and it granted independence to Cuba. That's where all that took place. Okay, the Great War, which is World War I. This is the shaping of the 20th century. Our major alliances during this war was France and Russia. The Central Powers were Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now we have a problem with the Great War, or World War I. America stayed out of that war as long as they could. When they came in, it was at the last minute. They stayed 6 months and the war was over. But it was expensive and it was costly. We declared war on April 6th. The first U.S. combat troops arrived in France during the end of May 1917. Over 3.5 million U.S. servicemen would reach France by the end of 1918. Just a year and a half later, the war ended with armistice in November 1918, 6 months after the Americans arrived. Over 1 million Americans saw active combat service. That's a large army to be exposed to military. American and European forces suffered over 320,000 casualties, of which 50,000 were killed in the war. 250,000 got injured. 50,000 died in World War I. That's not a huge number. America, Civil War, 625,000? Wow, there's a difference there. Okay, now the next one is going to be the big one. The Great War and the Spanish influenza. This should help you if nothing else will, okay? Signs were all over the place. Don't spit. Influenza was being spread like wildfire. It was only affecting the young people, the healthy people, okay? By the end, let's see, by the end of the war, the Great War, an estimated 9 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen died from all the countries. We only had from Europe and the United States 50,000, but counting all the countries, they lost 9 million soldiers, sailors and airmen, mostly from Russia. That's big stuff. That's World War I. By the time Germany comes in and invades Russia in World War II, you know how many people they lost then? And you add those two together? They don't like this arithmetic. Russia loses the largest number of people in each war. Millions. An estimated 5 million civilians also died during the war. The Spanish flu outbreak, which began in 1917 at the same time, carried by our military servicemen to Europe, okay, eventually killed 20 million people worldwide. Now, if you add what we lost in World War I of 9 million and maybe 5 more for civilians, that's 14 million. And the Spanish influenza comes along, that's what it looks like under a microscope. It comes along and takes another 20 million in the same time period. We lost 34 million people in 2 years. As you look in the future at a 1920 birth date of your parents, they survived, but they know the names of those who didn't. It was that personal. Too many people died in that time period. I think of this next slide. That's a mutilated cluster of cells combined with hog and human cells into this destructive pandemic. 1917 to 1919, a 2-year time period, 34 million people was a time to die. Our weapons became stronger, more vicious, more effective at killing. Then we had another problem. In 1973, that building on the left burns. And guess what we have in that building? 16 to 18 million records of service members who served from November 1912 to January 1960. This represents 80% of the World War I records burned. There were no other copies. So when we look at a World War I draft registration, because they had to register, that's good, and we don't have a lot more. We could have had unbelievable amounts of information from the service records, but we lost it to fire. The National Archives records, such as draft registrations, are available at fold3.com. For military cemeteries, you can go to gravelocator.sem.va.gov, or for overseas cemeteries, you go to abmc.gov. This next one is going to be World War I Treaty of Versailles and what happened there that caused, in reality, World War II. At the signing of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I in 1919, the French general Ferdinand Foch said, "This is not a peace," referring to this peace treaty. "It's an armistice for 20 years. In World War II in Europe was to begin 20 years and 65 days later. It's this treaty that Hitler used with the German people to convince them that we got a raw deal out of this. They're making us pay for everybody's expenses. And, you know, the burden is too great. And we'll never, 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 ever get up on top and be normal people again. It's too punishing." So Germany had been wronged, and Hitler used this as his incentive to get the German people to go back to war again. Appeasement from 1933 for the United States until the takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1938 kept us out of the war for 5 years in World War II. The Prime Minister of England, who was Prime Minister Chamberlain, kept believing that Hitler's not that bad, you know. After a few encounters with him, he said he really is. People in England voted him out, and who did they bring in his place? Who also told them before this whole thing came along, don't trust Hitler. Well, he came back, and he saved the British people, and he was right. Okay, World War II. For the Americans, they had a real problem. They had to support their allies in World War II in Europe. And then what happens in December of 1941? Pearl Harbor. We're involved in 2 major wars without the Europeans helping us very much over here. We have to fight this one ourselves. But our money and our commitment and our troops had already been sent to Europe. We had to come from within ourselves to build a second army, a second huge navy this time. And we had to go fight somebody that had already taken over all those red countries around Japan. They were big. China was a big koala bear, or a big teddy bear. They had the people, but they didn't have the military. They didn't have the money they have today. And therefore, Japan said, we need more land. We're on an island. We don't have enough natural resources to sustain our growth and our people. So they went out and took it. And in Hawaii, they started with us too. The Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1940 day, led to the day of infamy speech by President Roosevelt before Congress on December the 8th, 1941. Admiral Yamamoto, who developed the attack on Pearl Harbor, is purported to have said after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," with a terrible resolve. Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th because Japan had just declared war on us a few days before, and now we had 2 major wars to go to and won both. Very few countries have ever been affected by that type of statistics. How many people were involved? Nearly 4 years of fighting in 2 different parts of the world at the same time. Many of you had parents and grandparents that put their lives on the line to preserve the liberties that we have today and to have the peace that we sometimes get very close to letting it go. We've got heritage like you can't believe, and we forget. And we have a tendency to go backwards and have to learn it again. World War II ended in Europe, and then a few months later in Japan, after dropping the 2 most powerful bombs ever known to man in August 1945. The first atomic bomb that was built in New Mexico, they built 3 at the same time. They gave each one of them a different name. They dropped the first one in the deserts just outside of what? Yes, My father was a fire chief at that Air Force base at the time, and his responsibility was easy: keep the scientists from blowing us up. Every building had the chemicals written on the corners of every building, so you knew what they were using inside. So when you got to the fire, you'd know what to use to help counteract it to put out the fire. He was there about 4 months. And they called all the men from the Air Force base. It wasn't an Air Force base, it was a military base. They took them out in the desert, and previous to that, they dug a big trench in the sand. They put them in that trench and gave them dark sunglasses and told them, just peek over the edge because we don't quite know what this thing's going to do. They built a stainless steel tower, and they didn't want to drop the bomb onto the ground. They wanted it to explode a couple of 100 feet above the ground to see what effect that would have. Now, the scientists had figured out that if you split an atom, it will split other atoms, and before long, you've got yourself a real bomb. But they didn't know when it would stop splitting. They didn't know if dropping that bomb was going to cause a reaction around the entire atmosphere of the Earth. They didn't know those things. They couldn't figure that out on paper. So they had to drop one on their own people. The military were 10 miles away from the first bomb that was exploded in New Mexico. The cattle in the desert, the side that was facing the blast, was fried. The military got a bill from all the farmers around after this first blast for all the animals that they had lost. And they said, "What in the world was that?" The newspaper said, "We had some old ammunition left over and we had to explode it. It'd be safer that way." That was the first bomb. Those military men were so excited after the bomb, they went up to the crater that was created in the desert, and they gathered up melted sand, which was now like glass, and they were stuffing it in their fatigues. When they came back to Los Alamos, the MPs fortunately knew what a Geiger counter was, and they said, "Holy smokes, what have you got in your pockets?" They made them empty their pockets and go into showers. They destroyed the clothing, but those men were covered in radioactive material. There was only a few hundred of them, but they survived because they just happened to be 10 miles away from that blast. Lucky. That was my father. The total deaths in the United States as a result of World War II is going to be 416,800 people. There were 16 million Americans this time serving in uniform in World War II. Now that affects every family. That's a lot of people. World War II was the first war in U.S. history where combat deaths exceeded health disease deaths. All the previous wars, you lost more from having too many people in crowded conditions, and they didn't have sanitation going for them, and they lost more from disease. But in this war, we lost more casualties from fighting than we did from disease. The total deaths in World War II from all the countries is somewhere between 60 and 70 million people. So there was no war that ever took more toll than that one did. It was the deadliest war in the history of the world. The military deaths were from between 22 and 25 million. The civilian deaths ranged from 40 to 52 million. And the USSR had the highest death toll with an estimated 26.6 million people, military and civilian. Yes. 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 The Civil War lost, what was it, 625,000. World War II, our biggest, was 400,000, okay. But if you count World War II and all of the wars, it's still less people died in all the wars than just in the 4-year Civil War in America. That's staggering numbers, okay? Now, I'm going to finish with the last couple of slides so that you have a little bit of an idea what took place in America's weather. The weather is always the same in the United States, and we never have any storms. It never gets too hot or too cold. We never have floods, and heavens for Betsy, we never have hurricanes or tornadoes, right? So our ancestors have never had to worry about any of those things. There's a book that was printed by an author that probably no one has read. I tried finding it in Mesa. It's not here. It's not in our website library here in our library. But it is on the internet and it's available. The two books would cost you about $100. This particular author, by the nice name of Ludlam, compiled these two volumes to cover the history from 1604 to 1820 in the first book, and from 1821 to 1870 in the second book, and he documents all of the bad weather conditions that took place. Now, why is it important? Because the next slide shows that in that book I found that the cold storm of 1857 was the coldest time period that our country ever went through. Most of the country on the East Coast was reporting minus 40 degrees. Now you need to know a couple reasons why that was bad. If your ancestors, like mine, lived in a log cabin, the fireplace was used to keep you warm. The firewood, which is stacked outside the cabin, the door has to open a couple of times a day. You go out, you get the firewood, and you go to the outhouse, and you come in. But every time you open and close that door, what does the temperature do in that little room? That was one cold time period. They didn't have central heat. They didn't have any way of really staying warm. And if you use that little bedpan thing that you put under the bed and use it for emergencies, I'm sure that added a special fragrance throughout that small room also. So you begin to understand your ancestors better when you figure out what was going on in their lives. Okay? This next one is hurricanes and tornadoes. Have we ever been without them? If you live in the Midwest, it's called what? That red strip right through there is going to get hit. It's the underbelly of the United States. Those storms come right in through Louisiana, Mississippi area, and they just devastate those farms in that area. It's the richest topsoil in the country. We grow most of our grain crops in this same area. But when that wind blows, it knocks over everything. So the grains of corn and wheat and oats and barley and rye, they're some of the finest grain crops grown anywhere in the world. But we send tornadoes and hurricanes in on top of them all the time. The families that have lived there had to learn how to deal with it. When you talk about migration to the territories from the pink areas where the colonies got started, as they kept moving west into new lands, they had to keep figuring out how to make a living. As they got away from that deep, rich, dark soil of Missouri and Kentucky, Tennessee, and they got west, they got rocky ground. They got a whole different place to grow things, a different season. They had to learn how to survive. So the migration west definitely had its effect upon us. This next one shows the trails that were used. The red one is the Oregon and Mormon Trail. The brown one right through the middle is called the Fremont route. The one at the top where you see the green, that's the Lewis and Clark route to get west. But they all got their start where? Yep. More than likely what city? St. Louis. St. Louis, Missouri. Yep. When you go there today, they've got a great big arch. And what do they say? Everybody passed through that arch to go west, right? So it was great for business. All the merchants that were selling things liked that idea. Migration west by statehood. In the 1700s, the red states are the colonies that became the first states. As they moved west, they kept having the different years that they became a state. 1912 was some of the last states in the continental United States In 1959, Alaska, and Alaska and Hawaii the same year, 1959. That makes up our 50 states. Many of you have lived in America under a flag that had 48 stars on it, right? It was true. Okay? So the last one that I want to show you is going to be the migration west by ethnicity. The reason I find this one interesting is because of that little statement I said earlier. Birds of a feather flock together. The purple area is our Afro-Americans that came into this country, not voluntarily, right? The pink area is our Hispanic or Mexican population, mostly through the southwestern part of the United States. The orange area, which you're going to see right in the middle and a few scattered areas up north, is where our American Indians have grouped. The violet colored area is going to be English. Now, I'd always think you'd think English like northeast section of the United States. But look out there in Utah, Idaho, that area. Why? How many came from England, joined the Mormon Church, and brought their English ancestry with them? Enough to make a big pink area on that map, right? Thousands, many thousands. Okay? The bright blue, which is hard to see it, you got to look around to find them. Up the very north part, closer to Canada, is the French. The light blue color, which is most of the map, is where the German families settled. They're mostly the farmers. They're the ones that went out there and built a picket fence, one post after another one, and made it straight, and painted every picket fence white and every barn red. So that's our heritage. Now, those that were of Irish descent, where did they go? Wherever the girls went. The Irish, when they came to this country, they got their start over here on the East Coast, yes, but immediately they found that they could survive in the north, the south, the east, or the west, as long as the girls were there. That's our Irish. Okay, now, by knowing the history of your country, more importantly, the history of the county that your families lived in for long periods of time, then you get to know your ancestors better. And you get to find them by families, not just an individual name. Find all of them. Don't leave any behind. Our website address for this library is mesafsl.org. Click on that address and then click on the webcasts. And all of the many webcasts that have been presented here in this auditorium are recorded there. And anybody can go in any hour of the day or night, click on that link, and watch these webcasts again and again, and pick out the things that they want to know. In 2 weeks, on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock at this same location, Sister Shirley Nance is going to be our speaker. She's going to be talking about the Fantastic Four websites. She's referring to how to search for families in those 4 major databases: FamilySearch.org, Ancestry.com, Find a Grave, and Google. So that's 2 weeks from tonight, and she'll teach the research method that she says is making her search so exciting today, and more efficient way of finding her family members. We encourage you to come back again. If you have any questions, let's take them right now. I think we've done it. Held you a little bit longer than you may have wanted to be here, but the history of the United States and your ancestors was 400 years. You should have seen how long this presentation was when I gathered all the slides and said, there isn't anybody human that's going to sit there that long. So you only got about 66 slides. I accumulated 120. Thank you very much.